Welcome. You're listening to the Praxology podcast, where theology fuels the mission of the church. We're helping leaders to think biblically, to reflect theologically, and to act missionally. This season, as you know, is all about discipleship, and this half of our season focuses on issues in discipleship. My name is Killian Spies. I co-host this podcast with Sean Smith. Good to see you, Sean. How are you doing?
Hello, I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. It's a weird early morning for some reason. Sean and I were both missionaries with Josiah Venture in Central and Eastern Europe, and in partnership with Morelands College, we're equipping young leaders in our part of the world to impact the church and the world. And today, we'll be talking about the impact of trauma on discipleship. And for this, we have our friend and expert with us, Abi Maguire from Morelands College in the UK. Welcome, Abi. Good to see you this morning.
Thank you very much. I think definitely friend, not so much expert, Killian, but it's really great to see you, and super thrilled to be here. And thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great. Great to spend some time with you. Tell us more about yourself. What do you do? What's your role with Morelands College, and maybe what you enjoy teaching, and also what you're researching?
Thank you. Great. So my name's Abi. My official title is the Director of Learning and Student Experience at Morelands College. What that really means in practice is that I head up everything to do with students. Morelands runs higher education programs, so I look after the sort of learning side, the pedagogical side of their studies, but the pastoral side of their studies too. And my job really is to help our team to invest in the lives of students, to help equip them with the skills that they need to be good followers of Jesus. So my day-to-day role is on the ground with students. I love them. I love my role here. It's challenging at times, but incredibly rewarding. And so, I've worked at Morelands for just over 5 years. I started in the middle of the pandemic, I am based. Morelands has a campus in the UK, and I'm sort of based and live there on a day-to-day basis. And sort of my background is theology, but also theology and education. So lots of my teaching is around education, but I teach Christian ethics and doctrine. I guess my main passion is to help people understand some big words coming, sort of like what we call theological anthropology. So what does it mean to be human? How do we understand what it means to be a person in this world? How do we understand what that means for our relationship with God? How do we understand what that means for how we live and work and act in the world? So my research really, it's got a sort of few different forms and characteristics to it, but I'm really passionate about how do we help leaders and the world understand what it means to live as a sort of human who's flourishing, and someone who is in right relationship with themselves and with others and with God in a world that is sort of rapidly changing. So that's where my research lies. And recently I've just written a sort of a book chapter really on the impact of trauma on forming disciples in my context. So it's sort of like a reflective piece. It's about the things that I've learned as a leader in theological education, how we can be sensitive to the changing needs of the students that come our way, but also help them to understand the world that they face when they leave. How do we train them to be good leaders for those in their communities who have a variety of sort of experiences and events that happen to them that might be traumatic. So that's my research. That's where I am. That's what I feel called to do at the moment.
Nice, so cool. Was it weird to start a job in the middle of the pandemic, or right at the beginning of the pandemic?
Yeah, I think it was weird to sort of meet students online, and yeah, it was a strange time for them, a strange time for us.
For sure.
But hey, we're in a different place now, and I'm grateful for that.
Yes, thank God. And the Moorlands campus is located in Christchurch, right? Which is right next to Bournemouth, or is it part of Bournemouth?
Yeah, sort of like a suburb, I suppose. Yeah.
Which is right at the coast, right? Are you a beach person, or you're a mountain person, landside person?
I am a beach person. We have the wonderful blessing, really, of being 5 minutes from the sea, one side, and 5 minutes from what we call the New Forest, which is like a huge national park, on the other side. And so I spend most of my weekends, spare time in one or the other, depending on the weather.
So cool. Nice. This is like the perfect spot. I finally need to get come over.
You'd be more than welcome.
Yes. Sean, let's plan a trip, okay?
Sounds good. Sounds good. It's nice there. I have been there, so it's good.
Right. Yes. Nice. Cool. So you said that you help students flourish in their studies, but also generally people flourish in their lives, or you want to research that. What does that mean exactly, flourishing?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think it would depend on who you asked. That term is quite, it's become more and more popular. It's sort of got Greek philosopher roots to it. But I think for me, that sort of idea of right relationship with self, God, and others is really important. So what does it mean to flourish? It means that I am rooted in my identity in Christ. I know who I am. I know whose I am. I am able to understand the good news of Jesus and its impact on my own life, but also the way that I serve and follow God. I think, it's sort of got an upwards capacity and an outwards capacity to it. So what does it mean to be flourishing? I think it doesn't mean that things are right, that they go well all the time. Like, it doesn't mean that we are immune from difficult times, but it means that we are very aware of what it looks like to follow Jesus as an apprentice in those spaces.
I love that. Is it do you feel like that's in some way related to living life to the full?
Yeah, maybe? I think so. And you know, that, as I said, like, it doesn't mean that really deeply challenging and traumatic and grief-inducing experiences don't come our way. But it means that we can hold a space where we can approach those things from a position that has wholeness at its center.
Yeah, I like that idea of wholeness at the center. And if for me, a lot of people may actually have heard the term integration, like a personal integration. And as you were speaking, I was thinking there's this idea of overall well-being or flourishing. There's a dimension upward to God, and there's a dimension outward to humanity. And the sort of like connection point is really somehow inside of me, but it's not about me. So some people may have heard that word, like a personal integration, that I don't know. That's quite a technical and psychological term that has a direct relation. But I like that you're drawing together the upward and outward, because both relate. And I think that one of the keys that shouldn't be missed in what you were saying is that they both do relate. It's not, well, I'll use the broad term mental health, which has its own issues. It's not, I'll put that aside for the sake of, my mission right now. There's actually an aspect of flourishing or integration of both of those things. So I appreciate that. I don't know if is anything else that you would want to unpack from the upward outward dynamic before we get officially into some of the more difficult questions.
Yeah, and I wonder whether we might head this way anyway. But I think the upward and the outward are really linked together. I think alongside the upward and the outward is the inward, our own relationship with ourself, and And for those who've experienced trauma, that can be challenging. That sort of sense of relationship with self. So I think flourishing involves a relationship with God, relationship with others, but it also is about right relationship with ourselves. Every part of us that is really important. I mean, we live from a place of that integration involving the parts of us that for those experiencing trauma can feel sometimes quite separate.
Yeah, the term fragmentation, or like a mirror that's broken in a bunch of little tiny pieces. We often, I mean, that impacts how we see clearly, both ourselves and also how we see God, and how we can kind of, in some sense, project things onto God that may or may not be true of him from our own experiences and so forth. We probably won't get into some of those things. And I'm largely fascinated to have a conversation, maybe at a different point, about the idea of what exactly it means to be human and why that matters so much. I think that a lot of listeners might not quite understand the time that we live in. That my discipline, more in the realm of just systematic theology, is seemingly coming to the same point of what does it mean to be in relationship, and therefore who is a human? What is humanity? These are really, really important questions that a lot of different theological disciplines are asking right now. And I find it just a fascinating thing. And I wonder if part of it's because of the nature of what we see around us in our ministries across Central and Eastern Europe, across the UK, related to forms of trauma. And I suppose there's a caveat that we should give, and maybe I'll let you give that in a way that you feel is appropriate. But you're also working on a chapter related to this idea of disruption, and I assume that means trauma as a potential disruptor, but how that can lead to flourishing or transformation. Maybe you wouldn't use the terms together. That's okay. You can distinguish. But within that, it's speaking specifically to how trauma impacts discipleship formation. So with what you're able to discuss from that, can you tell us more?
Yeah, thank you. So I think the first thing to say is, trauma is a sensitive topic. I don't know for some who are listening that they have seen or experienced trauma themselves, or are serving and ministering to those in their communities who have experienced similarly. So the sort of caveat there is that it's really important when we're talking about trauma to make sure that we are keeping ourselves safe and taking things at a pace that sort of honours our well-being. So I guess if there are listeners here and that is affecting them, my encouragement would be just to take it at your own pace. Pause recordings and come back later. There's no need to hurry. I'm not going to talk about anything that is particularly inflammatory, but these things are sensitive. So I do think it's important that we take good care of listening to our bodies in the middle of that. I think for me, my chapter really is about how we understand trauma in the context of discipleship, and I think the language that we use is very important. So certainly in my context, trauma as a term is a muddled one. So we have, as I'm sure it's the case in lots of places in the world, we have major trauma centers that sort of describe hospitals, right, that are specifically concerned with the most poorly, the most ill people, sort of the focus there on the physical aspect of trauma. But that's not really the type of trauma that I'm talking about in my chapter. But certainly here, in more conversational language, trauma has become, in my opinion, a sort of a bucket that we, as a culture, have tended to put every negative experience in. So it's like, things are just the everyday experiences of human life have certainly for young people, oh no, that's traumatic, when actually they mean something quite different to the way that I'm using it in the chapter. So I'm not dismissing the impact of negative human experience, but I'm not really talking about sort of just general negative human experience here. I'm talking about trauma really by its, I quite like the definition that the UK government and others use this sort of definition where trauma is the experience of events that are sort of harmful or life-threatening, that have long-lasting effects. So it's quite a complex definition, but there's sort of three elements to it, and I think this is really helpful. That really there is no such thing as an inherently traumatic event. Okay, it's our experiences of that event that carry trauma. So I don't know, two people could be in a car accident, for example, and one could have a very traumatic experience, and one could have an experience that doesn't have the same level of trauma assigned to it. It's our sort of experiences of that event that shape how its impact, and there are loads of factors that affect our experiences: our cultural impact, our genetics, our childhood experiences, our resilience. However, there are loads of factors about that shape our experiences. So I think the experiences of an event is really important, and then the sort of long-lasting effects of that. I once heard somebody say that sort of trauma is best described like a filing cabinet, and so when you are a person is sort of normally approaching life, they're able to sort of categorize their experiences and file them away in the brain. And what happens in trauma is because the event is just too much, too scary, too life-threatening, really, too overwhelming to process. The brain or the memory doesn't file them away. It sort of just stays active and stuck. So it's almost like the brain is acting as if danger is still happening, even though people are safe. So that's sort of what trauma is, but its impact then is quite substantial. So it has this, you used the language of disruption, Sean, earlier, this sort of nature of trauma can disrupt quite, I guess, like conventional or really fundamental theological frameworks that we use in discipleship. So things like suffering and healing and who am I and who is God and what is God like and how do I understand the world? Who am I? Those big questions get disrupted because of the effects of a traumatic experience.
So you're saying that the picture of ourselves, what we just talked about, the inward, upward, outward dynamic can be disrupted by an experience, and that experience can be very subjective, so what has a traumatic effect on one person doesn't necessarily have to have the same impact on a different person, like the same event. And it's not just trauma is not just any negative experience, but something that impacts us, that is overwhelming and impacts us long term. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so sometimes and often that has a sort of life-threatening element to it, but it really is any experience that overwhelms an individual's capacity to cope. So that might be a singular event, it might be sort of cumulative events, it might also be sort of historical or much more embedded cultural narratives that can be equally traumatic. But you said subjective there, and I think that's right. I think subjective there isn't a negative thing. It is, we all experience things differently. The way that I experience eating my dinner is different to my children experiencing dinner, and so we all have experiences that are inherently subjective to one another. But I think something that I've found helpful, I quite like an analogy, is that the experiences of trauma are incredibly embodied. They're felt experiences. So one of the most helpful analogies I think I've heard of a previous student who experienced trauma and described their experience was, I don't know if have you ever had or maybe this is an experience you can relate to, something stolen from you, or your house broken into. Okay. Now, if you ever had your house broken into, or something stolen from your house, there's a sense that your house, which should be the most safe place that you inhabit, it's where you're most yourself, it's where your family are, it's where your possessions are, it's where you feel most at home. The experience that people have when their home is broken into is my home doesn't feel safe anymore. I can't sleep. I can't work out. I can't feel settled in my home anymore because somebody has sort of burgled me or stolen, broken into my home. And the same is true in trauma, but that home is the body. I don't feel safe in my body anymore. I don't know who I am. I don't know how I can be myself or feel myself in my own body. So that sense of being, the similarities there between having a house broken into and that house being your body, I think, is a really important narrative for lots of people who experience trauma, that their bodies don't feel safe anymore.
Oh, interesting. That's a helpful metaphor to understand it. Yeah.
Within that, there's I think a lot of very, very sensitive and difficult issues. If we take it more at a general level, it seems like what you're saying is, and I want to try to simplify language, but a lot of times people will talk about having a capacity. Like if you think of a balloon, it's fulfilling its potential if it's aired up and it can, sail away and whatever, fly around and then come back down. It's not a great example perfectly, but if that's a full potential when it's got the right amount of air it's supposed to have, but it seems like experiences can kind of take that air out of you in a sense, and so you're operating with less of your overall potential, and that basically then impacts your experience or ability to make meaning, as some people will say in more of the theological circles. I have a question here. This is quite a specific one. I appreciate if we'll have to talk around it maybe. The idea is experiencing the past in the present. Mm-hmm. And obviously that can really confuse experience. How does that lead to transformation? I'm kind of jumping the gun a little bit, so we'll probably have to take this in steps.
Yeah, thank you. I think a couple of things. I wonder whether trauma inherently challenges some of the frameworks or paradigms that we have of discipleship being a linear process. We start at the whole of us being at, 0% like Jesus, and then we move towards being, 25%. There's this sort of there's this linear trajectory that we think that discipleship is growth in one direction, and that direction is holiness, right? The idea that we become more like Jesus, which is true, the Christian life is about becoming more like Jesus. But trauma sort of disrupts those narratives of growth being linear in one direction. And I think, if I'm honest with myself, just generally as a human, discipleship just so often doesn't look like that. There are parts of me that grow at different rates. There are bits of my life and my experience that I feel are growing more than others. Other bits feel sort of more stagnant, maybe, or static. And so I think two things. One, that trauma really disrupts that narrative of growth, and that's okay. Sort of the paradigm of progress in one direction over time is one that I think is open to be challenged. What does it look like then to grow within the shatter? I think the way for sort of post-traumatic growth to occur is not by trying to do more better, sort of think yourself better, pull up we have this phrase, like pull up your bootstraps, sort of, try, just pray more, just be more better. Actually, the Christian life is one where that agency is one of the Spirit. It's the Spirit who does the transformation. It isn't us, even though we get to participate in that process. And I think for me, there is a real beauty in the picture of the gospel that takes the broken and the shattered parts and puts them back together, almost in spite of us. That sense of pain and disruption and trauma is something that God draws towards and not away from. And sometimes the sort of the growth or the post-traumatic sort of move towards progress comes not through kind of traditional methods, but just in presence, say God being present with us in these experiences.
Yeah, that's fantastic. There's a lot of people. I think Preston Hill, he does some work with Christ and trauma, and talks about post-traumatic experiences and so forth of us today. And there's a whole growing field here that's more in the,
right,
if I can say, theoretical realm a little bit. It's important, but a little bit detached from dealing with human people directly, which is where we're sort of wanting to focus now.
Yeah.
But in that, there's so many more questions we could ask. I think I'll just press us on into the next one, because it bridges human experience and also some of the philosophical things at the same time, I think. It comes from C.S. Lewis, and he talks about a wonderful book of, in some senses, dealing with his own pain in a book called The Problem of Pain. He says what I think a lot of people maybe assume, if I can say that. Say a youth leader to assuming something about a young person, that you went through this rough experience. Maybe it's trauma. There's levels of that, layers of that we've discussed. God's going to really use that to grow you. And that probably doesn't sit very well with, like, I still have a lot of questions if I just went through trauma and I'm still dealing with I'm carrying that backpack around, and every once in a while something comes out and I have to deal with that. And so it's not a linear process. And Lewis says, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. I wonder if this has any relevance for some of the things that you're talking about with trauma in discipleship.
Yeah, thank you. I'm a big C.S. Lewis fan, of course, English. But the phrase is helpful. I think one thing that is often disrupted in trauma is that people often lack the language to be able to describe adequately their experiences. They are, I guess, inherently often wordless. They can't read. Language sort of falters at the side of trauma often. And so this idea that God moves towards that, understands that, sees that, knows that, doesn't try to fix that too quickly. We often have a narrative of important hope in Christian ministry, and we really need to hold on to that. But that doesn't mean we need to rush too quickly to sort of a restoration narrative that trumps human experience too quickly. So C.S. Lewis's sort of quote that it's God who speaks in the middle of that is incredibly powerful. We might, for those experiencing trauma, we might lack the language that comes with being able to sort of put our experiences into words, but we have a God who is incredibly understanding and empathetic. He witnesses those things, doesn't shy away from those things, and is able, in a sort of justice sense, to speak very powerfully in those circumstances.
Yeah, I This really struck me when I was at a conference last year at London School of Theology. It was on pastoral and spiritual abuse. And the main speaker, I can picture her face, but her name is escaping me. You probably will know it. But that really is beside the point. The thing that impressed me there was it takes a long time for people to develop the language to understand what happened.
Yeah.
And then it seems like there's this separate thing of developing a language for how that impacted me. What can I share? What's appropriate? What's healthy? What's not? What's going to get somebody potentially fired? What's a bunch of really complex questions. And it left me with one very simple question of how do we not rush the narrative for people who went through something really significant? How do we disciple them that takes into account they need to develop language and we can't necessarily give it to them? Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, it does. And I agree with you. And I think for me, in education, that becomes a bit more acute. Education, certainly in my context, is all to do with coherent words, whether that is verbal or written. We expect students to have quite coherent narratives of the way in which God is working in their lives, how they're growing, what their aspirations are. And actually, I think that's true in the church too. And so one of the questions I pose in my article is how are we creating space for those wordless activities for meaning making? And that doesn't mean that we expect students to sort of have to articulate their trauma or tell us about it even. But it does mean that we're creating spaces away from sort of logocentric or very word-centered practices, spiritual practices, essays, assignments. How are we facilitating space for the human experience to be described without words?
What comes to mind for me is that the end of Romans 8, that the Spirit is praying and uttering these kind of wordless groans. And it makes you wonder, we can't make an ultimate claim here, of course, but if that's a deep experience, that the Spirit is bypassing a lot of those systems, it would seem like, that we're struggling with, and can speak loudly, as Lewis says, into the deepest parts of the soul. What do you suppose is appropriate for somebody who's discipling another person, whether that's in a youth group setting or a teacher in a classroom with a student? Example, how do you help somebody to see that where God actually is working, while also giving them that space to wrestle with the complexity that still doesn't have words?
Yeah, I think this is incredibly challenging for me. This on a personal level, as somebody who really wants to see God's work in students' life, but maybe in the way that I'm perceiving it. I have a sort of fixed idea about what it means to grow, and so there's a real challenge there for me, almost a conviction, I think, of my job as somebody who's discipling others and teaching disciples to disciple others. My job is to open the space for the Spirit to do His work. I can help guide and facilitate and witness what God is doing, but I found the most growth, and maybe this is an encouragement for those who are listening too, is my job is to open the space for the Spirit to do His work. And the way that I do that might change depending on the individual and the context and my church background and setting. But trying hard to hold hope for an individual who might be experiencing trauma, that God is present with them, that it might take a long time, but that post-traumatic growth can be a wonderful, beautiful thing, but not being quick to rush that process or to put my timeframes on it. I think that's really important for me. So my job is really just to witness and to be privileged in the process of God at work, and to not rush that.
Mm-hmm. For sure. In 2024, our team did a research during a conference of youth leaders across Central and Eastern Europe. And most of them said that a discipleship journey is like a hike up a hill. And the stereotypical European loves a hike. But it's I'm not into hikes. But when I hike, I do it with other people. And maybe that's maybe that's a helpful image. It's a hike, it's uphill. Sometimes there are times where we rest, sometimes it goes back down, and then we go back up. Of course, in a hike, the upwards part is the more difficult. Well, on discipleship too, probably. But yes, I want to sort of move us into the scope of youth leaders and how we help others, how we help others helping others.
Mm-hmm.
Youth leaders are very, very busy, and in Central and Eastern Europe, it's very common that they are volunteers and mostly untrained. So how can they lead ministry and at the same time develop learning about trauma and helping others to walk with God in their trauma, and maybe at the same time walk with God in their own trauma,
Right.
especially in areas where psychologists and counselors are very few, and there isn't loads of training. How what could be some ways youth leaders could develop?
Yeah, thank you. I was interested that you said earlier, Killian, that you like going on hikes with other people, and that the sort of discipleship journey is up and down, but it's one that you do with other people. I think for me, one of the most important things that we can do as youth leaders and as those training youth leaders is presence. It's to encourage those who we serve and that we come alongside, that they're not on their own. And so that's a very embodied experience, and a wonderful theological one as well, that we're not designed to live on our own, and that we are designed to be in a community of brothers and sisters who are
For
family
sure.
together. And even the narrative of family might be challenging for some who are experiencing trauma. I get that, but the sense that we, as youth leaders, we don't have to have all the answers. We are not, for many of us, we won't be trained professional therapists or counsellors, and there is a place and a need for that, and a need for us to recognise that we might not be that, we're not expected to, don't think, to be trained professionals all the time, but there is, I think, a couple of things that we can do. We can help young people and youth leaders to create safe spaces for young people. Now, that doesn't mean that those spaces are not without challenge. I think there's a legitimate times where we need to be saying to sometimes, we think that God is offering you a better life, and so there's a challenge there that comes with a movement towards God. But creating a safe or a brave space for young people and for ourselves. I think this is true of education as much as it is in discipleship in church years. My students can't learn very well if they don't feel safe. And so one of the jobs and the privileges that we have is, as best as we can, within the resources that we have, to try our best to create spaces that feel like people can be themselves. So that's part of it. But part of that means that we draw towards pain and not away from it. We try to acknowledge that that we have the wonderful privilege of being together, that we're not on our own. I think some of those things, I guess, sort of very basic things, sort of empathy, presence, witness, sort of brotherly companionship in the way that we can encounter and encourage one another. Those sort of, I guess I'm not teaching people here anything new, but those sort of basic Christian values of compassion, of empathy, of warmth, of love are just so important in trauma-informed care and practice.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I heard what you said just reminded me of a quote from or something I heard Andy Mineo say. For those of you who don't know him, he's an American rapper, but he said that vulnerability, we think what it does, it pushes people away, but it actually draws people closer. So like being the openness and invites others to connect with us, and maybe that could be maybe one way to create a space like that. But I think that's connected to something that you said earlier, right? Creating those safe spaces where people feel seen and loved and valued, and maybe can feel like themselves in their own bodies and in their own minds again after they feel broken into. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's good.
Mm-hmm. If I can draw on that, there's some project on disciple making in opportunities and challenges that our team is doing across Central and Eastern Europe. And this is very anecdotal, even though it comes from data. One of the things that's really jumping out is that there's a need for a young person to feel like they can overcome a challenge, for example, that a leader must be vulnerable. So there's this aspect of leaders running toward the pain, but it's not like you run into a fire without the right clothes on. You know, if you're going to be a firefighter, you have to have the right fire retardant things so you don't, and all of this. And this just has me kind of wondering, a youth leader or somebody in a classroom, how they can run toward that pain well. And it seems like you're saying a relational presence. So do you think that the first step of that relational presence is seeking to understand that person's point of view and maybe being okay with silence?
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's a sense that before we try and fix the problem, I think human nature is often quite quick to want to solve. We like things in, often people like things in categories. We like things to be fixed and sorted. We don't find mess an inherently easy place to be. But there's a real, that in that drive towards a young person, we're saying, look, I see you, and I want to hear. I want to understand your experiences, almost without me putting, or us putting, our own preconceptions on what those experiences might be. And that even if that doesn't have language to it, as we talked about earlier, there's still a power in saying, I see you and I hear you, and even if that hearing you looks like silence, that you're still present in that moment. I think the other way that I think is really helpful to view these sorts of things too is, often, not always, but often in discipling relationships, some of the role that we can play with young people is I hear you and I see you, but come and see what I have seen. It's a come and see and experience God at work, and that for each of us, wherever we are on our sort of discipleship journeys, those are often quite embodied, very powerful experiences that are far and above the sort of cognitive. Even as a theologian, my experiences of God's work in my life are often so personal and experiential. We're saying to our young people, hey, look, I see you and I hear you and I know that you feel stuck and disrupted, but come and see what I've seen. And so it meets them, and it allows them to embody their experiences, but it doesn't always leave them there. That through compassion and kindness, we are able to sort of hold on to hope often when they've lost it.
So not just seeing their disruptive situation, but helping them move into transformation with God.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Nice. Right. Sean, you have a last question, and then I have a last question.
Yeah, as we're drawn to a close here to manage our time well. This has been such a I think really fruitful conversation overall to this point. And it seems like what we've just circled around, kind of a summary, if I can, to see if it's accurate, is knowing when to provide safety and when to provide challenge. That I'm withholding things about safe spaces and so on, but for a leader, for somebody in a classroom setting, in a youth group setting, when is it the right time for safety, and when is it the right time to really lean into that and maybe say, is there something that you can move forward here? That's that's a friction. I don't know if there's anything you would have to say there.
I think for me, challenge always comes from a place of safety. So we really need to invest in the safety first before we challenge. And I think, this is, and I really hope I'm not oversimplifying here. I think the models of Jesus are really helpful, that he moves towards, he allows space, he deliberately seeks out pain and disruption, not just to listen to it, but to heal it or to restore it. And so the model of Jesus, I think, treats both compassion and movement forward together. But the compassion is the thing that motivates. And so I guess for us, or for me, one of the things I've learned to do is just to check myself. What's my motivation here? Like, am I wanting to challenge because I am grumpy that I'm not seeing the growth that I think that is mine? Or am I motivated by compassion? So for me, I think there's absolutely, you're right. Like, we have to hold compassion and witnessing and presence with challenge, but the motivation is really important. And for me, there's just almost like a pause that I need to do, just check in with how I'm doing prayerfully to know what am I trying to achieve here? How am I modeling Jesus's right and move towards first before I want people to move on?
Yeah. And I'm just bouncing off of that. Speaking of Jesus, from your maybe your personal experience or ministry experience or your research, what is a biblical verse or a story that supports your thinking about trauma and discipleship?
I wish I could choose just one.
The transformation of that, yeah.
I wish I could choose just one. I think two spring to mind. If I can use two, I'm going to be cheeky. There's
that's allowed. It's okay.
Thank you. The story. I love the story in 1 Kings chapter 19, where Elijah is running from Jezebel and is fearing for his life, which is often the experience of those who are experiencing trauma. And sort of says, I've had enough, I can't cope, this is too much. And then we get the angel who comes along and treats Elijah with very basic but very embodied realities. The angel touches him, that sort of, I'm with you, you're not on your own, encourages him to get up and to eat and to rest. Like there's a very important message, I think, there for us when we're treating people who are experiencing really challenging and difficult pain, to meet very basic nervous system needs, that's really important. So I think that's one that struck me as very important for sort of ministry and work with students. And then this is sort of a personal favourite of mine, if I'm allowed a favourite Bible verse. I love the picture of the high priest in Hebrews chapter 4, end of chapter 4, where we see that Jesus is a high priest who, the NIV says empathizes with our weakness, but that's a much more embodied phrase. It's a much more experiential, it's a much more somatic, like a bodily experience. And why does he experience those things? So that we might approach God's throne of grace with confidence and receive help. So it's a purpose. Jesus' empathy towards us and his sympathy towards us, his identifying with human suffering, is so that we might approach God with openness and confidence. And for me, all those things speak into trauma. That idea of safety, that idea of coming alongside and understanding, that idea of not leaving us where we are, bringing us towards God so that we might receive mercy and find grace. This idea that Jesus is a high priest who not only knows our embodied suffering, but is able to do that so that we might approach God with open and transparent and welcome arms, is just a picture that I love.
That's amazing. I love that. So cool. Well, we don't have any more time, but thank you so much, Abi. This was so not just informative, but transformative. Haha, see what I did there. Nice. Cool. So cool. I feel like this needs to end this episode, if I feel like it needs a little bit more than just a short summary. So, Sean, would you mind praying for us, and also our listeners, the youth leaders, the young people that are listening to this, that they would be able to hear that, absorb that, incorporate that into their daily lives?
Yeah, I think as all good conversations happen, they usually end in prayer and to be continued, which is the definition of what's happened for the last hour. So let me pray for us. Father, we thank you for the mind that you have given to Abi. We thank you for her coming to share with us, and we just recognize that Father, this is a very sensitive topic and very, very different for all people who come across this, who listen. I pray that you would do your work, Spirit, of moving into sensitive areas and speaking into them, that you would bring beauty from pain, but that you would also allow those people, allow us in our different experiences from, the levels of trauma, to really sit with those and to not shy away from the difficult questions, but that you would give a courage for those individuals to sit with you in those questions and not immediately jump to an easy answer. And I pray that you would give youth leaders in Central Eastern Europe, across the UK as well, a sensitivity toward young people, and a keen ability by your Spirit to understand when to really lean in and be just a relational, listening presence, sharing good empathy, and ultimately being Christ-like to that person, to those people, but also that you would give an ability to understand when to challenge, but also not to place expectations that are not healthy upon other people. And there's such a discernment that we need your Spirit for. And so that's what we pray in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you again, Abi. Looking forward to seeing you soon in our team meetings. and at some point we'll be surfing the waves of Bournemouth and South England. Sean, you're invited too. Let's go.
I might watch from the sand while you guys surf. I know that I can do that.
It's just an attempt to make people laugh about me. Great. Well, the surfing, not the talking about it. Anyways,
thank you.
It's been so fun, so cool. Thanks for being on. Thanks again, Sean, for how we do this together. That's so cool. Until next time.
Thank you.